Tonight in RCVTV, we're going to be taking you back to class and we're going to be talking about wire. Alright, so in this video we're going to be talking about a couple of different things. We're going to be talking about the types of wire that I'm going to be talking about today. We're also going to be talking about lengths of wire, your thicknesses of wire, and how you can use that to make your coils a little bit better. So, first thing we're going to start off with is everyone's most popular wire type, Kanthal A1 wire. Now, this stuff is what most people use when they're talking about building coils, and it's because it's what everyone's used for the longest period of time in the vaping world. This is the kind of stuff that you'd be using for just your straight wattage mode. You can use stainless steel for straight wattage mode as well, but we'll be covering that a little bit later on in this video. Now, two major differences between these two wires that I have in front of me. I've got 22 gauge Kanthal and I have 30 gauge Kanthal. Now when I'm talking about the gauge, it's the size of the wire. With these guys, it's just like earrings or other things out there in the world. The bigger the number, so 30 versus the 22, 30 is actually a smaller gauge of wire than the 22 is. The 22 is actually thicker. So 22 is actually a fairly thick wire. It's kind of hard to see there on the camera, but it's a fairly thick wire. Now, when we're talking about gauge of wire and your length of wire, I like to kind of throw an analogy in there for it. So I describe it as kind of like a highway. When you're talking about the thickness of wire, you're talking about how many lanes you have on that highway. The more lanes you have on that highway, the easier it is for traffic to flow across it. So the easier it is for electricity to flow across it. Now, if you have a very long piece of wire, I'm going to be talking about basically between two exit points, so merging lane and then to your next exit. So if it's a fairly large amount of distance between those two exits, even if you have a lot of lanes, it's going to be a high congestion, lots of traffic, higher resistance. So when you're talking about resistance of wire, you're trying to find a balance of how thick you want it to be and how long you want it to be. Now when you're talking about length, it's a little bit different. Obviously, your thickness of your wire is literally just the thickness of your wire that you choose to build with. When you're talking about length, we're talking about how many wraps you do around an object like this little guy. It's also affected by not just only how many wraps you do around something, but the diameter of what you're wrapping around. So this little guy, this little dowel, it's kind of hard to see there on the screen, but this has got 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, and 3.5 millimeter dowels all stacked on top of each other. So you can build them at different thicknesses, basically. Now, or inner diameter. Now, like I was saying, you're trying to find that sweet balance between how thick and how long you need the wire for a certain amount of resistance. So I'm going to throw up on the screen for you steamengine.org. This is a wonderful website. It's an awesome tool to use for when you're building. You can literally plug in the exact gauge of wire you're using, the exact type, the exact resistance that you're aiming for, and it will tell you how many wraps you need around how large of an inner diameter you need to achieve that resistance. Now, Now, when we're talking about other types of wires, there's things like nichrome. Nichrome is basically, think of it as Kanthal, but 80% of this is nickel. So the benefit to using this wire is that it's going to have a lower resistance in a thinner wire, so a higher gauge, but it is a little bit easier to work with and a little bit harder at the same time. So it's a little bit easier to bend, which is a good thing because it's a lot easier to wrap a coil with, but it is also a lot easier to actually mush your coil when you're heating it up and squeezing it together and stuff like that. When people are using nichrome, it's usually used in something, say, like a Clapton coil, which I'll have an image up on the screen here for you. These are usually used as either the core wires going through the center or just the outside to give it that lower resistance, because usually when you're using a Clapton, it's usually a lot thicker, a lot bigger, a lot more wraps, so you're trying to keep the resistance within a sweet spot, and that's why people use nichrome for that. Now, there's also nickel. Now, nickel is the softest of the bunch. Nickel and titanium are probably the two softest. Now, nickel is specifically used for temp control. When you heat up nickel past a certain temperature, it can produce nickel oxide. So if you're going to use nickel, please use it in temp control modes. Now, most of the time when you're using nickel and you're wrapping your coils, you're aiming for a certain resistance that you're kind of comfortable with temp control, and it's usually around the 1.2 to 1.5 ohms of resistance. And the problem with doing that with nickel is you end up having to do quite a few wraps, and it's very hard to get it to heat up evenly without it melting or bending and stuff like that, because it is such a soft material to work with. Now, my personal favorite, I haven't been using it as much as I'd like to recently, but stainless steel. Now, stainless steel can be used in both temp control as well as just your plain standard power wattage mode. Now, the benefit to using this is that it is probably the safest to use for temp control, because you can't hit it at a certain temperature, at least your vapes can't get it to a certain temperature where it gives off any bad or harmful fumes or anything like that. So that pretty much covers for this video. Thanks for watching, and as always,
Subscribe to the channel, like the videos.
Follow us on Instagram and Twitter.
like us on Facebook, and until next time,
Make smart choices.